My name is Carmela, and until recently I thought I had my life together, as well as it was possible to be at 38, divorced, with a 10-year-old son and a job that was more demanding than I had ever imagined, and yet it felt like it had a sense of control and logic, as if I had carved out an island of predictability for myself in the chaos of the daily race to meet the schedule. I am a department head at Wilson & Clark Trading, an export and logistics company, and over the past decade I have managed, step by step, without much fanfare but with a tenacity that could only be described as dogged, to rise through the ranks from a junior analyst to a department head who now employs 15 people. My working day starts at 7:30 in the morning and ends, if I'm lucky, around 8 p.m., and sometimes even later, but the pay, I must admit, is good, and, what's more important, I can afford not to worry about tomorrow, at least in a mundane sense, which, after the divorce 3 years ago, has acquired an almost existential meaning. Stability, even if illusory, has become my main need. My ex-husband, Emanuele, and I broke up, as sometimes happens, quietly and without loud scenes, when conversations gradually become formalities, and a look alien, and at some point we both realized that we had become almost strangers to each other. We maintained friendly relations, for the sake of Alvise, our son, first of all, but, I think, also for the sake of that part of ourselves that still clung to the memory of something once real. Emanuele works as a freelance graphic designer, which gives him some flexibility, and he picks Alvise up from school most days, feeds him dinner and helps him with his homework, and I, after another day at the office, stop by their place after work to take my son home. We hardly talk, not because there is hostility, but rather because there is no need. But sometimes he smiles when he watches Alvise jump into my car and nods, silently, and that is enough. It suits us, I told my colleagues when they asked doubtfully if it was hard to live like this, and Alvise seems to have adjusted well. Despite constantly moving from one house to another, he, unlike adults, accepts change with much more trust. "Mommy, can we go to our grandparents this weekend?" he asked one Friday evening as we were driving home, his voice full of hope. "I miss playing with Emily and Leonardo," I sighed, not because I didn't want to, but because, checking the calendar on my phone while the car was stopped at a red light, I realized it had been almost a month since our last visit. "Of course, honey, I'll call Grandma tomorrow morning," I said, and he nodded happily. The truth was, I'd been putting off these family dinners. It wasn't that I was ashamed of my family, but over the years they had become something complicated and annoying, like a splinter that couldn't be removed. Especially my younger sister, Vanessa, who had always been the golden child, not because she was perfect, but because her parents always saw in her what they wanted to see. Ever since she'd married Durant, the perpetually smiling and smug insurance salesman, and had 2 children, her perfect family life had become more than just a way of life for her. It was a kind of showcase that she showed off at every opportunity. Every time we met, whether for Sunday lunch or a holiday, she found a way to emphasize that I was a divorcee, as if it were a stigma, a sentence, a failure that she generously reminded me of with false delicacy. "Wait till you see what Durant got me for our anniversary," she would say with a smile that concealed the sting of triumph, and she would show off yet another bracelet or ring, then add, as if by accident, "It must be really hard to do everything on your own, Carmela." I didn't let it bother me, or, rather, I tried not to, because I knew that Vanessa had always envied my career success. She had dropped out of college when she met Durant, assuring everyone that she had found her calling in motherhood and domesticity, but judging by the calls and texts, her reality was far from her story. Although I had managed to build a comfortable and secure life for myself and Alvise, what irritated me most was not her condescending attitude, but the hypocrisy with which she, playing the role of a well-off mother, called me every time they had yet another financial difficulty. "Carmela, Emily needs braces, and our insurance doesn't cover them," she would say, almost whispering, as if apologizing. "Could you help us? Just until Durant gets his commission next month." Or, "Carmela, our car broke down and needs a new transmission. Could you lend us $3,000? We'll pay you back by summer." She never paid me back for the perfume I gave her for her birthday, and I didn't even remind her. It was easier that way, easier not to wait, not to hope, not to be disappointed. My parents weren't much better. 3 years ago, my father lost his job after a massive layoff at the transport company where he had worked for almost 30 years. And since then he has not been able to find anything permanent, and my mother, an English teacher, had already retired early, due to progressing arthritis. They called me then in tears, scared, because they were afraid of losing their home, and I, without thinking, agreed to help. At that time, it seemed like a temporary measure, but 3 years have passed, and every month I regularly send them $1,500 to pay for utilities and other needs, not because I feel an obligation, but because I can't do otherwise. They are my parents. But, I must admit, these transfers have become a noticeable burden on my budget, especially recently, when prices are rising and bonuses are being cut. It was Saturday morning. I called my mother and said that we would come for dinner the next day, and despite all my inner doubts and desire to postpone the family gathering for at least one more week, there was such genuine joy in her voice that I could not help but smile. "Oh, that's wonderful," she exclaimed, not hiding her pleasure. And a few seconds later she added with the same light, everyday intonation, as if she already knew that I would say yes, "Vanessa and her family will be here, too. I'm making your grandmother's stew, of course." She cooked. My mother never bought processed foods, was not lazy like me, did not bring apple pies from the bakery to the table, because she, as she liked to repeat, always had time for real home cooking. Alvise had been excited all weekend, and as we drove along the country road to my parents' modest house on Sunday afternoon, surrounded by old maples and lilac bushes that had lost their leaves in the summer, he kept bouncing up and down in his seat and swinging his legs, looking forward to meeting his cousins. "I can't wait to show Leonardo my new Minecraft world. I built a real obsidian castle there and hid zombie traps. Emily will be thrilled," he chattered, and I nodded, watching the sun glinting off his face, and, feeling the familiar warmth. At the same time I felt a little irritated about the upcoming evening, knowing in advance what tone the conversation at the table would sound like. When we pulled up, Vanessa's car was already parked in the driveway, new and silver, with tiny flower decals on the window and a pink plush mascot hanging from the mirror, another cute attribute of her carefully constructed display of family well-being. Alvise jumped out of the car before I could stop the engine, slamming the door and running toward the house, shouting something joyful, and I sighed, took a neatly wrapped caramel apple pie from Lisa, the owner of our local bakery, from the trunk, and headed for the porch. Baking from scratch had never worked out for me, not for lack of talent, but rather for lack of time and space for spiritual solitude, which, as I always believed, is necessary for real cooking. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon, stewed meat, and fried onions, and the aroma, as always, made me forget my worries and responsibilities for a moment, plunging me into memories of my childhood, when everything still seemed whole, simple, and predictable. Alvise disappeared upstairs with Leonardo and Emily, their laughter echoing down the stairs, interspersed with cries of joy and the sounds of a computer game. I found my mother in the kitchen, wearing her usual floral apron, her sleeves rolled up, her expression focused, and gave her a quick hug, trying not to get any flour or sauce on her, as she was basting her beef. As I set the cutlery on the long wooden countertop that Dad had knocked together all those years ago, I heard the sound of animated conversation coming from the living room. Vanessa, Durant, and my father's voices high, full of enthusiasm and barely contained excitement. "We'll be there, Dad," Durant said confidently, his voice carrying the same pompous conviction it always did when he was trying to sound businesslike. "We did our research. This food truck concept is on the rise, especially in areas where there's nothing unique. No one else does real Filipino fusion food. We'll be our own bosses." Vanessa quickly chimed in, "Finally, Carmela, we'll be financially independent." I bit my lip to keep from laughing, not because I wanted them to fail, but because the whole scene seemed farcical. Neither Vanessa nor Durant had ever run a business, they didn't have a rudimentary understanding of accounting, and last Christmas he'd managed to burn his macaroni and cheese because he'd forgotten to turn off the stove. But I finished setting the table in silence, trying not to interfere. When Mom called everyone to dinner, we gathered around the table like we always had, like when we were kids, and for a moment everything seemed normal. Alvise was sitting between his cousins, and all three kids were giggling at something on Leonardo's tablet, until Vanessa intervened with the same deliberately stern tone she used when playing the perfect mother. "Kids, put that away during dinner." Then she turned to us adults with a big, beaming smile. "So, we have some big news to share. Here it is," I thought, Putting down my napkin, Durant and I are starting our own business, she said proudly, as if she were talking about launching an international franchise, a Filipino fusion food truck. Durant's grandmother left him the recipes, and we found the perfect truck. Picture this: flavorful adobo, garlic rice, banana coconut desserts. People will line up. My parents nodded, making the usual sounds of admiration. That's wonderful, dear, Dad said, clapping Durant on the shoulder. You've always been so creative, Mom added, and Vanessa, beaming like an actress in the final scene of a play, suddenly cleared her throat and added, as if in passing, we just need a little startup capital, about $150,000. The room fell silent, tense, dense. Like before a thunderstorm, my fork frozen midair, just short of bringing a piece of meat to my mouth. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, and there was a no in those glances, even if they hadn't yet said it out loud. We'd love to help you, dear, Dad said slowly, but we just don't have that kind of money right now. I felt my throat go dry, and I cleared my throat and took a sip of water to buy myself a few precious seconds. Everyone turned to me as if on cue, expectantly, with silent agreement. As if the only logical progression in the conversation was my generous offer to finance their dream. Sorry, I said firmly, without raising my voice, but I don't have that kind of money either. Vanessa's smile faltered and her eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I know you were saving up the money from your divorce, the money you and Emanuele were putting aside for a house. It's in Alvai's college fund now, I replied, although that wasn't entirely true. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought flashed. But I also put some of it toward my retirement. After all, no one else cares about my future. Vanessa gritted her teeth, but she didn't give in. Well, you make good money at your job. You could get a loan, you have a great credit rating and a steady income. I looked at her in complete bewilderment. You want me to go into debt for your business idea? It's not just an idea, Durant interjected, leaning forward a little, as if he wanted to convince not only me, but himself as well. We've planned it all out. We've planned out a rough menu, figured out routes, we know where to stop to attract more customers. We'll pay you back as soon as we start making a profit. His voice sounded so confident that for a second it seemed as if he was not a man barely managing his family budget, but a confident entrepreneur on the verge of something great. I took a deep breath and, trying to keep my tone neutral, asked, when exactly will this happen? Have you calculated your operating costs? Do you have an idea of what the break-even point is? Do you have any experience in running a food service business? I asked these questions calmly, without irritation, as I would ask any other person who came to me asking for funding for a project of this amount. Vanessa's face flushed, not from shame, as I first thought, but from anger that had probably been building up inside her for months. She pushed her plate away sharply and hissed through her teeth, "You don't have to be so condescending just because you work for some prestigious corporation. Not everyone wants to be a wage slave their whole lives, taking orders from strangers and living in a drab office." I raised my eyebrows but didn't answer right away. Then I said calmly, "I'm not being condescending, Vanessa. I'm just asking the basic questions that anyone investing that kind of money would ask. Look, I think you should consult a business consultant before you get involved in this. The failure rate among restaurants and food trucks is really high, especially when they come into the project without a plan and without experience. You're just jealous." Vanessa screamed, slamming her palm down on the table so hard that the silverware jumped and the glass of water rolled to the edge. The children instantly fell silent, stopped chewing, stood with their spoons in their hands, staring at the adults with wide eyes. "You've always been jealous of me," she continued forcefully, "jealous of the fact that I have a real family, a husband, children. You're a divorcee. You can't stand the thought of Durant and me being successful and independent while you're stuck in your corporate office taking orders from some men in suits." She stood up with such abruptness that her chair crashed backwards. "Come on, Durant, kids, pack your things, we're leaving." Durant, looking noticeably less confident now, stood slowly, looking at the floor, as if he hoped that by not meeting the others' eyes he could avoid judgment. Emily and Leonardo, confused and still holding half-eaten pieces of pie in their hands, jumped up from their chairs, casting quick glances at their mother. Alvise turned his gaze from them to me, and in his eyes there was that anxious, acute concern that children get when their familiar world suddenly begins to crack at the seams. "Vanessa, don't be dramatic," Dad intervened, trying to maintain the remnants of order at the table. sit down and finish dinner, but Vanessa, as if she had not heard, continued to rush around the room, collecting her purse and throwing a light cardigan over her shoulders. I will not sit at the same table with someone who wishes me failure, she barked, and the next second the door slammed noisily behind her, leaving a silence at the table that pressed on the ears like thick cotton wool. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, but said nothing. I waited, hoping that at least one of them would acknowledge how foolish Vanessa had been, that someone would condemn her behavior, but instead Dad sighed heavily, looked in my direction, and said, "Carmela, your sister has been dreaming about this business for months. This is not just a whim, you know how much this means to her." I couldn't believe my ears. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice from shaking, "they have no business plan, no experience. And they're asking me for $150,000, would you invest in something like this yourself?" Mom interjected quietly, but with the firmness that usually came into her voice when she was trying to smooth over rough edges. "This isn't about investing, Carmela, this is about supporting my family." I felt the pent-up anger boiling inside me. "I support my family completely. I've been sending you $1,500 every month for 3 years, I've given Vanessa money countless times. How much more support do I have to give before you stop looking at me as a disadvantage?" Mom looked down and whispered, "This is different, we really needed the help, and you could afford it, and now I'm telling you I can't afford to give Vanessa $150,000, I said sharply. "Why is that so hard to accept?" Dad shook his head, not disapprovingly, but with the sadness that makes you feel guilty even when you know you're right. "Your sister is just trying to build something for herself," he said. "You might at least consider supporting her." I stood up, unable to contain the wave of suffocation that was building in my chest. "I'm not changing my mind about this. Vanessa needs to be realistic, and you two need to stop pandering to her." I turned and called Alvise. He approached slowly, looking once more at Grandma and Grandpa with that childish anxiety I had seen before. We said goodbye, and he politely hugged Mom, patted Dad on the hand, and we went out into the evening. The drive home was silent, and only the measured hum of the tires on the asphalt filled the car. Alvise looked out the window, behind which the lanterns, the darkening sky and the silhouettes of houses slowly floated by, and finally quietly asked, "Are Aunt Vanessa and Uncle Durant angry with us?" I slowed down a little to hear myself better, and, choosing my words, answered, "They're just disappointed, baby. Sometimes adults get upset when something doesn't go according to their plan. They're not angry with you, that's for sure." He nodded, but I felt that his little world had cracked, and this crack would go with him over the next few days. I also thought that this was the end, that Vanessa would cool down, understand how unreasonably she had behaved, and we would somehow smooth everything over, return to the usual routine, as it used to be. I was wrong. Everything turned out to be much more complicated than I had hoped. The call, like a harbinger of a storm, came the very next day after that ill-fated dinner. First Vanessa, then Durant, and then both of them, one after the other and together, with increasing pressure, as if trying to break through my defenses with persistence and volume. I answered the first call, trying to be calm, reserved, rational, although the voice inside was already ready to break into a scream. I said that I had thought about their offer, weighed everything up, and, having made a final decision, firmly said, "No, I am not taking out a loan for your business. This is not something I can or am willing to do." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, then Vanessa's hoarse exhalation burst out, "You are just selfish, you do not want us to succeed, because then you will cease to be our star, our example, you will no longer be the only one who has achieved something." I clutched the phone in my hand, as if that would somehow contain the storm of emotions, but I answered, "This is ridiculous, Vanessa. I want you to succeed, but I don't think starting with 150 grand in debt is the right way to go." The answer was sharp, like a blow. "Don't tell me how to live my life, just tell me you're too greedy to help your own sister." After that conversation, I didn't pick up the phone anymore. The messages began to arrive daily, first pleading, then demanding, then accusing, and finally just plain insulting. "You've always been jealous of me," she wrote. "You look down on us because we don't have degrees from prestigious schools, because we don't work in glass towers and don't wear suits. Selfish, you'll regret it when we become successful and you're alone." I wanted to talk to my parents, to ask them to intervene, to stop this torrent of madness, but it was clear whose side they were on, so I did the only thing I could for my own peace of mind. I blocked Vanessa's number and tried to focus on work, on Alvise, on anything but thinking about how my family had split. 2 months passed. I deliberately skipped monthly family dinners, citing deadlines, reports, new projects, although in reality I could not bear the slightest thought of another confrontation. Alvise, of course, continued to ask about his cousins, at first with hope, then with surprise, and lately with a childish sadness that he could not hide, and each time I felt my heart squeeze with guilt, because he did not deserve to be in the middle of an adult conflict that he did not understand. My only contact with my parents was the monthly calls from my mother, which had become surprisingly cold, as if the person on the other end of the line was not my mother but a stern accountant reconciling payments. "Just checking to see if you'll wire the money tomorrow," she'd say, without once asking how I was doing or how her grandson was. "Yes, Mom, same old. Okay, your dad's prescription costs are up again." And that was it. "No, I miss you." "No, how's Alvise at school?" "No, when are you coming to visit?" Just a businesslike confirmation of the transaction that left me with a bad taste every time. One evening, as I was checking my email and mechanically skimming a report, Alvise looked up from his homework and, looking at me with a serious, unexpectedly adult expression, asked, "Mom, why don't we go to Grandma and Grandpa anymore? Did they do something bad?" I froze, feeling something twitch painfully inside me, and, not knowing what to say, I sat down next to him, putting my arm around his shoulders. "No, honey, we're just taking a break from family dinners. Sometimes adults need some time alone with each other, to sort ourselves out. It's not because of you, it's not your fault." He nodded, and although he seemed satisfied with this answer, it left me with a feeling of uneasiness that would not go away in the days that followed. Thanksgiving was approaching, the holiday we always celebrated at my parents' house, amid the smell of sage stuffing and roasting turkey, with salads and pies and talk of the weather and the kids. This year there was no invitation. I tried to tell myself it was for the best, which meant things were still warm, but when I asked Alvise on the Wednesday before the holiday, "Are you looking forward to seeing Grandma and Grandpa tomorrow?" his face lit up with such joy, such pure, childlike hope, that for a moment I regretted asking. He said, "Do you think Grandma will make her special stuffing? The one with apples and pine nuts?" I hesitated. "I'm not sure we're invited this year, honey." His smile faded, his eyes grew serious. Why? Why weren't we invited? "We always go there for Thanksgiving." I looked at him and felt bitterness rising, not for my parents, not for Vanessa, but for everything that had been destroyed. "You know what?" I said finally, "You're right, we're still going. I'm sure they'll be happy to see us." I wasn't sure about anything, really, but I knew I couldn't let adult grievances ruin the little that held us together as a family, especially in the eyes of a child. The next morning, I woke up early and, humming to myself, made my signature sweet potato casserole with cinnamon, nutmeg, and a crispy maple crust. Alvise helped me, carefully covering the pan with foil, proud and serious, like a true helper. We left a little later than planned, but arrived at my parents' house at the usual time, around noon. The driveway was tightly packed with cars. I immediately recognized Vanessa's silver SUV and a couple of cars belonging to my aunts and uncles, the same ones that always showed up at the parties with identical baskets, pies, and identical stories. Alvise, not hiding his excitement, jumped out of the car first and, bouncing as he went, rushed to the front door, while I, trying not to drop the hot casserole, followed behind. He pressed the doorbell, jumping with impatience, and I, holding my breath, silently waited for who would open the door. Mom opened the door. For a moment, her face lit up with the routine smile that she always turned on in the presence of guests, but as soon as her gaze jumped from Alvise's delighted face to me, standing a little behind with a heavy casserole in my hands, her expression froze, as if petrified, as if she saw not her daughter, but an inappropriate visitor who accidentally intruded on someone else's celebration. "Carmela," she said, and her voice was both surprised and coolly reserved, as if my appearance had upset some carefully planned order of things. "We weren't expecting you." I felt my chest tighten, but I answered evenly, "It's Thanksgiving. We always come for Thanksgiving." She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously behind me, as if there was something going on in the house I shouldn't see. From somewhere in the living room, I could hear voices, laughter, the clatter of dishes, footsteps. The house was alive, hosting guests as always, as before, only without us. "Well, Come on in then, she finally said, stepping back a little. Alvise, your cousins are in the basement playing video games. Alvise, unaware of the awkwardness, immediately rushed down the familiar hallway, his heels clicking on the floor, and I, still holding the casserole in my hands, entered the house, trying to ignore the strange mixture of smells: roasting turkey, ground beef seasoned with sage, cinnamon, and a cold, unpleasant note of alienation that hung in the air, like a subtle but noticeable layer of dust on a surface that had not been wiped for a long time. I went into the dining room, hoping that maybe things would not be so bad, that the words would come naturally, that conversation at the table would melt the ice. But when I entered, I saw Vanessa, leaning over the table, carefully laying out napkins and cutlery. She looked up, and her expression instantly became hard, like a mask of frozen resentment. What is she doing here? She said through clenched teeth, not taking her eyes off my mother, as if I were not a person but the embodiment of inappropriateness. I stepped forward, holding up the plate in a gesture that was meant to signal peace, if not reconciliation, then at least an attempt to mend the bridge. I brought sweet potato casserole, I said stiffly, holding out the plate, hoping that at least the gesture would be taken as a sign of goodwill. Vanessa didn't answer. She came up to me, picked up the pan. And to my shock, she didn't take it into the kitchen or set it down on the table, but turned abruptly, walked to the trash can, opened it, and dumped the contents straight in without blinking. We don't want anything from you, she spat, as if the words were bitterness she could no longer contain. We don't want you here, go away, Vanessa, Mom gasped, but she didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there in the kitchen doorway, like she was hoping it would all go away. I stood there empty-handed, feeling the anger and humiliation rise from my stomach to my throat, but before I could say anything, Dad appeared in the hallway, his face confused, like he'd just heard a noise and wasn't sure what exactly was going on. Carmela came uninvited, Vanessa quickly explained, before he could even ask, after refusing to help us, ignoring us, all of us, for 2 months. And now she just barges in here like nothing happened. I took a step forward, my voice shaking as I began. I thought I hoped that you were wrong, Vanessa interrupted sharply, fury in her voice. You don't get to choose when you're a part of this family. You made your choice when you turned away from us, when you decided that money was more important than your family, when you put yourself above them. And with these words, she walked past me, past my parents, towards the basement where Alvise had gone. I felt anxiety squeezing my chest. I didn't know what she was going to do, but I knew that I didn't want to leave her alone with the children in this state. I ran after her. When we got to the basement, I saw Alvise sitting on the floor with Emily and Leonardo. All three were absorbed in a game, laughing, momentarily forgetting about adult dramas. Vanessa did not hesitate. She stopped abruptly in front of the children and loudly, with a commanding intonation, as if giving an order in the army, said, Emily, Leonardo, come here immediately. The children looked up, not immediately realizing what was happening. She grabbed their hands, pulled them towards her, as if she wanted to take them away, and, pointing at Alvise, said, You can't play with him. His mother is a bad person. She doesn't care about her family. She's a traitor, and he'll probably grow up the same way. I stood rooted to the spot, shocked, not believing that this had been said out loud, that an adult could speak like that in the presence of children. Alvise's face wrinkled, and the next second he quietly called out, Mom, and tears, large, bitter, flowed down his cheeks. He didn't scream, didn't call for help, he simply looked at me with that very pain that a child cannot yet describe, but can already feel all too keenly. Before I could say anything, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Dad. He walked down a few steps, stood looking down at us, and with a tired expression that I had once mistaken for wisdom, said, Carmela, I think it would be best if you and Alvise left. I turned to him, not believing my ears. Dad, you can't be serious. Vanessa just said some horrible things to Alvise. He's 9 years old. He stood there, staring at me, his voice even but firm. This is our home, and frankly, you've caused enough problems. If you'd just helped your sister like we asked, none of this would have happened. I looked around for some kind of support, some hint of sympathy, but Mom was standing at the top of the stairs, looking at the floor, avoiding my gaze. My aunts and uncles were nowhere to be seen, probably still in the living room, where they were trying hard to pretend they hadn't heard the noise, the screams, the baby's cries. Okay, I whispered, my voice shaking with anger and pain. Come on, Alvise, we're leaving. I took my son by the hand. He did not resist, but he cried silently, but not hiding his tears. As we walked up the stairs, past my mother, I slowed down, stopped in front of her. "I can't believe you're allowing this to happen," I said quietly. "Your own grandson." She looked up, finally meeting my eyes, and there was no pain in them, no worry, no regret, but something cold and alien. "You brought this on yourself, Carmela. Family supports family." We drove away without saying a word, and the silence in the car, as soon as I started the engine and pulled away, was so loud that even the soft hiss of the tires on the autumn road seemed almost deafening. Alvise sat next to me, huddled in his seat, not wiping away his tears, inconsolable, with that special look that children get when their entire familiar, understandable world suddenly falls apart at the seams, and they cannot find support even in those who have always seemed unshakable. I was gripping the steering wheel, but I didn't know where I was going. The thought of simply going home, to our empty, silent house, heating up yesterday's soup and pretending that Thanksgiving did not exist was so depressing that I felt tears welling up in my eyes. And then, almost instinctively, an idea struck me. "Listen, how do you feel about going to your grandparents instead?" I asked, casting a quick glance at my son, and seeing the hope that flashed in his eyes. I added, "I'm sure they'll be happy to see us." I immediately dialed Emanuele's number. He answered right away, and when he heard my voice, he didn't ask any unnecessary questions. He just said, "What happened?" I told him about Vanessa, about the casserole, about the humiliation, about Dad's reaction, about how no one, not even Mom, stood up for him. He was silent for a few seconds, and then calmly, but with obvious annoyance in his voice, he said, "This is terrible. Of course, you should come. Mom, as always, cooked 3 times more than necessary. They will be happy to see Alvise, and you too." We turned around and drove through the suburbs, past festively decorated houses, past people carrying dishes and bouquets, and the closer we got to his parents' house, the calmer my soul became, as if I was slowly emerging from icy water into warm air. When we arrived, the door was already ajar, and Emanuele's mother, a small, strong woman with soft hands and eyes that always knew when to hug and when to remain silent, met us in the warm kitchen, where the aromas of cinnamon, sage, and something else that is impossible to describe hung in the air. Perhaps it was just the smell of home. She hugged me tightly, without saying a word, just hugged me and only then whispered, "Poor thing, family conflicts are terrible, especially on holidays." At dinner, sitting at the table with Emanuele, his mother, father, and Alvise, who seemed to be laughing again for the first time that day, I told them everything, without hiding anything, about Vanessa's business idea, about the demands for $150,000, about my parents' reaction, about their silent approval of the humiliation that my child and I were subjected to. Mama Emanuele listened attentively, nodding from time to time, and when I finished, she said quietly but firmly, "I always thought your parents were too favorably disposed towards Vanessa. Even when we first met in college, I didn't want to interfere, admit it. I tried not to notice it for a long time, but now I can't deny it." Her words were not an accusation, it was simply an admission of a fact that I knew myself, but always tried to keep silent about, for the sake of the illusion of peace. For the sake of a sense of belonging that never existed anyway. In spite of everything, the evening turned out to be surprisingly warm. We ate, talked, laughed, Alvise played Monopoly with Grandpa, and then brought Uno, and as he encouraged us, tracking down combinations, I suddenly realized that this was family, a real one, the one that takes care of you not because you have to, but because you are. Late that evening, as Alvise and I drove back, already under a light snow that had begun to cover the streets with white sparks, I made a decision. Returning to the apartment, the first thing I did was open my banking app, find the tab with recurring payments, and without hesitation, cancel the transfer of $1,500 that I had been faithfully sending to my parents every month for 3 years, and for the first time in many years, I fell asleep in silence, without mentally calculating whether I would last until the end of the month, without feeling any fear or guilt, only lightness and liberation. 2 weeks passed, no call, no text, not even the standard checking to see if the money came in. Mom said nothing, Dad didn't either. Vanessa obviously either didn't know or still thought she was right. I threw myself into work, filling my days with meetings, reports, and plans, and trying to dedicate my evenings exclusively to Alvise. We baked cookies, watched old Christmas movies, and I started reading to him at night again, so that he would feel that even if the world was falling apart, his mom would always be there. I wanted the upcoming Christmas to be special for him, to somehow make up for the guilt he felt about ruining Thanksgiving. Then one evening, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, the phone rang. Mom was on the screen. I almost ignored the call, but curiosity got the better of me. "Carmela, it's me." Her voice was tight, controlled, like someone who had called with a purpose and was irritated by anything that kept her from getting to the point. "There must have been some kind of mistake at the bank. We didn't get your monthly transfer. No, how are you? No, how's Alvise? No, sorry about Thanksgiving. Just, where's the money?" I sat up, laid my shirt on the bed, and said, without raising my voice, "No mistake, I cancelled the transfer." There was a pause. Then, "What do you mean, cancelled?" "That's not right. We're counting on that money to pay our bills." "I can. And I did. After what happened on Thanksgiving, I don't think I owe you anything." Her voice grew more urgent, more urgent. "Carmela, it was just a misunderstanding. Your sister was upset, and things got out of hand." I laughed, briefly, bitterly. "A misunderstanding? You and Daddy kicked your grandson and me out on a holiday. Vanessa told the kids not to play with Alvise because he was bad, and none of you intervened. Not you, not Daddy, not a soul in this house. We were upset." People say things they don't mean when they're upset. Well, I meant what I said. "I'm not sending you any more money." Her tone changed instantly, from concerned to cold and accusatory, like an icy wind hitting her face. "You have no right to do this to us after everything we've done for you. We raised you. We sent you to college." I didn't scream, I just answered calmly. "And I've been paying you back for 3 years now. $1,500 every month. That's $54,000. Mom, I think we're even. It's not about the count. Carmela, we're your parents. You have to help us." I closed my eyes and, clutching the phone, whispered, "It's funny. I didn't feel like your daughter when you chose Vanessa. When you let her humiliate me in front of my child. You're supposed to be Alvise grandparents, and you let him cry. You let Vanessa tell you he was bad and you didn't say a word. Not you, not Dad. You're just taking revenge because we sided with your sister. You're taking revenge because you didn't get your way. It's petty. Carmela, think what you want. I've had enough." Those were the last words I said before hanging up, and despite the trembling in my voice and the way my heart was pounding in my chest, I felt something in that moment that I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity, without anger, without remorse, without fear, just clarity. After that, as expected, a new wave began. Calls, one after another, first from my father, then from Vanessa, then from aunts, uncles, even from those relatives with whom I had barely communicated in recent years and who suddenly, on command, as if mobilized, decided to remind me of my duty, of my supposed indifference, of the family values to which I was urgently called to return. I did not answer, not to calls, not to messages. I was ready for this. I was ready for manipulation, for accusations, for the spectacle of offended parents, but I was not ready for them to decide to show up at my work. It happened a few days later. I was in the middle of a morning meeting, discussing the annual report and first quarter strategic goals with the team, when my assistant knocked quietly on the office door. She looked worried, as if she didn't know how to start. "Sorry to interrupt, Carmela, but your parents are in the waiting room. They insist on seeing you." I felt myself shrinking inside. The world I had built for myself in order suddenly began to crack again. Through them again. I apologized to my colleagues and walked out into the hallway, trying to maintain my dignity despite the growing feeling of helplessness and anger. Mom and Dad were sitting on the couch in the waiting room, looking tired, disheveled, but also demonstratively unhappy, as if they wanted everyone they met to feel sorry for them. "This is unacceptable," I said quietly, coming closer. "I'm at work, this is my place, and you have no right to come here without an invitation." Dad looked up and answered, without trying to soften his guilt, "You don't answer our calls. What choice did we have?" "Leaving. It was your choice, Carmela. We could lose our home." Mom sobbed, and her eyes filled with tears. "The same technique that used to work on me without fail, breaking down my defenses and blurring boundaries. But not today. I supported you for 3 years. Now I have my own family, and I am not ready to sacrifice them anymore. Find another solution." Dad jumped up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Okay. But don't think you can crawl to us when you need something." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar, painfully banal. When did I crawl to you, Dad? When did I ask? I was always the one who pulled, the one who offered a shoulder. It was always the other way around. I motioned to the security guard, "Please escort them out," and as they were politely but firmly ushered out, Mom turned, took a deep breath, and spat out one last thing. "Your sister was right about you all along." That same night, a text came from Vanessa. It was so predictably venomous that I didn't even feel anger, just exhaustion. "You're a vindictive, selfish bitch. Mom and Dad could lose their home because of you. I hope you're happy, Ms. Hyen, you powerful corporate drone." I blocked her number, then went on to delete and block my parents, all my aunts and uncles, all the people who had lined up to judge me, unaware of the circumstances or the price I'd been paying for years. It was unexpectedly easy. The release was almost physical, like a weight that had been lifted from my shoulders for years, so heavy and familiar that I hadn't even realized how much it had been weighing me down. A month later, I ran into my cousin Beatrice at the grocery store. She looked a little embarrassed when she spotted me, and her expression reflected that awkwardness you get when you run into someone you genuinely feel sorry for but don't know how to approach. "Hi, Carmela, how are you?" she asked cautiously. "I'm fine, thanks, how are you?" "I'm fine," she said. And then paused. "Listen, your mom asked me to talk to you. They had to take out a loan to cover the mortgage. They say you left them because you're still dealing with the divorce and you're jealous of Vanessa." I shook my head, feeling not anger but almost ironic amazement rise inside me. "They tell everyone that?" "Almost, and Vanessa, well, she tried to borrow money from everyone, even my husband. Can you imagine? It's like we just have an extra 150 grand lying around for the food truck." I chuckled. "Did she tell you that I refused to help because I was jealous?" "Something like that, but no one believes that. We all remember how Vanessa has always been, well, practical when it comes to money." We both laughed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that not the whole family had turned away. Not everyone believed the fairy tales they so diligently spread. "How does Alvise cope with all this?" Beatrice asked. I looked away, thought, then answered. "He misses his cousins, yes, but he's tough. We spent Christmas with Emanuele's family, and it was wonderful, warm, really. I'm glad." "Look, Emily and Leonardo have a birthday next month. I'll be there with my kids. Maybe Alvise would like to come? I can pick him up and bring him back. You won't have to see Vanessa." I thought about it, then shook my head slowly. "That's very sweet, B, really, but I don't want to drag Alvise into conflicts. He's a child, he shouldn't have to figure out who's right and who's wrong. Let's just organize a separate meeting with your kids, a playful one, without adult intrigues." "Okay, I understand." And I knew that she did understand. When I finished shopping and got home, I suddenly realized that I felt lighter than I had in years. The monthly transfers, the stress, the burnout from trying to please, it was all gone, gone. I was no longer someone's ATM, the responsible daughter, the silent victim. I was myself again. That night, Alvise put down his homework book, looked up, and quietly asked, "Mom, are we ever going to see Grandma and Grandpa again?" I sat down next to him, put my hand on his shoulder. "I don't know, buddy, right now. Mom and Grandpa need some time apart, partly because they were so mean to us on Thanksgiving, and partly because sometimes adults disagree, especially on big things." He thought about it, frowned, then said, "Like when I fought with Leonardo about Pokemon and we didn't talk all day?" I smiled, holding back tears. "Something like that, only a little more serious, but you know what? No matter what happens, you have me, and Dad, and Grandma and Grandpa, who love you very much, and no one can change that." He nodded, went back to his tasks, and at that moment I realized, after many years of living in a mode of constant giving, it was finally time to invest in us, in our peace of mind, in our well-being, in a future in which I no longer forget that I, too, deserve love, respect and choice.